Welcome to the North Island Candidates meeting at Comox United Church. For those of you who have not silenced your phone, we ask you to do that now. And before I start introductions, I'd like to make a comment that we are all here gathered on the land of the unceded territory of the Comox First Nations people. I also want to acknowledge all of the people that have been working behind the scenes for this evening's event. My name is Dale Earhart, and I'm your moderator this evening. And the regular moderator is Ross Griffiths-Cochran from our church. But right now, he's enjoying a fancy cocktail with an umbrella on it over in Morocco somewhere. So you'll have to put up with me. But there were many more people than myself that were behind the organization of this. Comox United Church has always been very involved with the community, and we have an outreach committee that puts together different parties and different organizations, including the group that was helping organize this event. They gathered a whole series of questions from you good folks, and they had to vet them and try and put them in a decent order so that we could present them for you tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge Bob Wells and the My Tech guys for putting on the live streaming event. This is being recorded live so that we can watch it at home, and it's also going to be available after the meeting if you'd like to use it for review. Thank you. Our timers tonight are Kathy Talbot and Sue Grant, and they are holding up the cards to make sure that our candidates stay right along the time, because as you know, you folks are going to get very warm in here this evening, and over time, we want to make sure that the questions keep moving along as rapidly as possible. The questions have already been provided to the candidates, and I'm going to be able to present them for you up on the board, so you can watch and see whether or not they're answering your questions. We will not have an opportunity as an audience to do any rebuttals or rebukes. In fact, I'm going to ask you all tonight to be even more Canadian than you already are. I attended the Courtney briefing, and they were amazingly polite and cooperative. So what I'm asking you to do tonight is to politely clap for a very short period of time for each candidate when they finish their comments, and then keep all verbal comments, please, to yourself, and try to do that as best you can. If someone feels that they have to disrupt, we'll have to ask you to leave the building. So it's really important that we make this worthwhile for all of us. It's worked extremely well in the past, and I know we can count on you again today. Now, there will be rebuttals, though, and that is, if our candidates could hold up their little Canadian flags, please. And they get to wave and play with them only this moment, because now they're not allowed to touch them again unless they have a rebuttal. So if a candidate answers a question to which another party member wishes to rebut, after the original speaker has spoken, they then raise their flag, and they can do it up to 2 times, and their rebuttal will be 1 minute. Speaking of timing, we're going to be introducing the candidates in alphabetical order, and their opening comments will be 3 minutes. Once the questions start, their questions will be answered within 1.5 minutes. At 15 seconds to go, they will be shown the yellow 15-second flag. And of course, when their time is up, they will be shown the please stop flag. And we really ask them to do that. If they continue past that, then I will have to interrupt them as well. And I know that they are really good at this. They're very professional. You know, I've already mentioned that we wanted to thank all of our volunteers at the church. We have a donation basket at the back for those of you who do want to help and support some of the causes that we do look after here at Comox United. But the other people I obviously want to recognize is our candidates today. These people have given their personal lives, and their families have taken tremendous sacrifices. It's really easy to take pot shots at politics. It seems to be a national sport, but it's really also very, very difficult to try and do the right thing. And these people have the courage to do that and to try and to listen to your causes. So big round of applause. Thank you. If we get through the 12 questions before 9 o'clock, we have some spare questions, but if not, we're going to try and stop it at 9 o'clock, and then there'll be time for their closing remarks, and their closing remarks will be 2 minutes each. So their opening remarks are 3 minutes. They have 1.5 minutes for each question, 1 minute for the rebuttals, and the closing remarks at 2 minutes. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the the panel tonight. And please withhold your applause to the very end. I'll roll right through these folks fairly quickly, and then I'm going to allow each one of them to stand up to introduce themselves. And like I said, on behalf of all of them, we all acknowledge that we are here on the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation, and I'm sure they appreciate that, so that they've acknowledged that with us tonight. Our first candidate is Rachel Blaney of the New Democratic Party of Canada. Beside her is Shelley Downey of the Conservative Party of Canada. Mark De Bruin of the Green Party of Canada. Carla Neal of the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. Brian Rundle of the People's Party of Canada. Peter Schwartzoff of the Liberal Party of Canada. And Glenn Staples, who's running as an independent. A big round of applause for all of the candidates. And if our good timers are ready, I'd like to introduce again in alphabetical order. We're going to be sliding the questions down as they go through so that we'll have everyone else have a first start. But for now, alphabetically, we'll ask Rachel Blaney to introduce herself. Thank you. You can do it right there. You can go to the mic.
All right, in 3 minutes, start. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Blaney. I'm very happy to be here with you all today, and I want to thank all the people who volunteered and worked so hard to make this happen. I know since the line change of the election line between Comox and Courtenay, it's been a challenge, so I want to thank them for stepping up twice in 2 elections. So I'm here as your Member of Parliament for the past 4 years, reapplying for the job, and I'm really grateful for the experience that I've had. I just want to say that in my time, I worked really closely with municipal, regional, and Indigenous governments to help us access the funding that we've needed. And we've seen a good increase of funding coming to our riding into communities that just need to move forward with infrastructure, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, some really good resources that we've been needing. Still a long way to go, but we're starting. I also was really happy to serve as the spokesperson on seniors issues. And that was an amazing experience for me. And when I got given that role, I did 11 town halls across the riding. And one of the things that I learned was that a lot of seniors in our communities were getting divorced or legally separated because when their loved one, their partner, went into a care facility, most of their pensions were going to pay that cost, with only 20% coming back to the one living at home. And so I was really proud to speak about that in the House of Commons and work with a Liberal and a Conservative MP. And we collaborated and we talked to the minister, and we actually saw that changed in this country so that that doesn't happen. I thought it was shameful that people have been married, in some cases 50 years, were having to get divorced just to make ends meet. I was also the spokesperson on veterans issues, and as the person who represents 19 Wing, and we know how many of our veterans come home to the Comox Valley to stay with us after they retire, it was a great honor for me. I got to work on housing issues with veterans. We got to work on service standards and get some change. We still have a long way to go because so many of our veterans are having to get changeover of their case managers, which means they're having to retell their story again and again and again, which isn't right. And then the last role I had was as the Vice Chair of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and right before the end of the session, worked really hard on Bill C-92, which is about returning the care of Indigenous children on reserve to their communities. We know how many children more now are in care than were in residential school. So I was proud to get some action. I'm still fighting to get the resources and the money that they deserve in that, but the fight continues and I really look forward to it. So I just want to say in closing, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It has been a huge honor to serve the people of this riding. And in my term, I've done over 30 town halls, been in communities, and I'm really proud of the work that I have done, and I hope I get to continue to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Mark De Bruin from the Green Party.
Thank you, Dale. Well, it's a pleasure to be here on my home turf in Comox Valley. Yes, I am Mark De Bruin of the Green Party of Canada. This is my first shot at running for a position like this. I've lived here in the Valley for about 23 years now, 3 years on Cortez Island, where I was the school principal, and for the remainder of the time here in the Valley out by Bates Beach. So other than being a principal, I've taught a lot of science in my life, from college to high school, doing chemistry and biology, That's my main background, is in sciences. I was not a fisheries biologist, but a fish biologist, which is a little more on the academic side. And I worked in the Arctic on gas pipelines doing environmental assessments. So I became involved in this adventure about 5 years ago when I could no longer sit still at what I saw happening to our country. There were two major things happening. One was a real erosion of the integrity and the honesty, the authenticity in our government. There were so many stories being told by the government of the time, and a lot of it had to do with obfuscating climate change science. The government sought to dismantle a lot of the scientific community in Canada, especially fisheries in Winnipeg. That's what really was the straw on the camel's back for me when Stephen Harper underfunded that institute and sought to basically eradicate the library by dumping it in dumpsters. So I stepped forward because I couldn't sit still any longer. I joined the Green Party because we are doing politics in a very different way. First of all, the Green Party is the only party that is truly global. We have partners all around the world in many other countries. We all subscribe to the same basic core principles that guide everything we do, our policies and our vision. Those principles are things like sustainability. I'm going to read them out because I always get them mixed up and jumble them up when I try to do this. Nonviolence, social justice, ecological wisdom, participatory democracy, which really translates into proportional representation, and respect for diversity. And everything we do is governed by those 6 guiding principles. We also don't whip our MPs, which means that we are fully free to represent our constituents. We are never told, in fact, it's in our constitution, it's illegal for Green MPs to be told how to vote by their party leader or by the party itself. We are very proud that we are collaborators. We have the most solid climate plan by far. We've been working on it for over 10 years, and it's so well fashioned that we're ready to jump into action with it. So I look forward to sharing more of this through your questions. Thank you.
Our next candidate is Shelley Downey of the Conservative Party.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this blustery evening, and it's very much appreciated that you would give of your time to come and hear what we have to say. So, I was born and raised in northern BC, and I've been on the island since 1991. My husband and I have raised 4 kids here, and now we have 5 grandchildren that are being raised here. In that time, I spent my time volunteering, helping with youth groups and coaching teams, and in a variety of things. I've served on a school board, and I'm currently in my 4th term as a counselor for the town of Port McNeill. Done accounting for a variety of sectors. More recently, before leaving the private sector, I was with West Coast Helicopters, and now I work in our family business. We have a couple of businesses that we run, and so I am active in that, and that keeps me pretty busy there for now. So my question to you is, like, you're probably wondering, why am I running? And I'm going to say this to you. I'm running because Canada deserves better. We've been underserved by our current government. We've lost credibility in the Arctic. We've lost credibility on the world stage. Our sovereignty in the Arctic is being challenged. And in this term, we've had 80% of our residents have seen their taxes increase. Poor management of fisheries is affecting livelihoods all across the riding, and 4 years of overspending during a time of no wars and no recession, no recession is irresponsible. So our Conservative platform is based on getting ahead and not just getting by. To that end, a few of the measures that we've proposed is scrapping the carbon tax and taking the GST off home heating bills. In addition, we're looking at a universal tax cut that will benefit anybody who's paying taxes up to the $47,630 range. We're increasing the tax age credit for seniors We're also will make maternity benefits tax-free. Conservatives right now are the only party that are supporting the resource sector. And I say this because last summer we saw what happens when decisions are made for political reasons and are not science-based. The Chinook salmon closure was not recommended by DFO. It was an 11th hour political decision, and it affected many across the riding, whether they were commercial fishers, sport fishers, or retail business stores. Many of these had invested either in maintenance of their boats and vessels or filling up tackle shops, only to have the rug pulled out from them. On April 16th, the Chinook fishery changed on the inland here on the Inside Passage, and there was no corresponding revenue until latter part of July. So I'll say this to you. We can do better here in Canada. We can. We've also had more recently on October 1st, our aquaculture industry has now on the line with a recent policy brought down by the Liberals. So thank you for coming this evening.
Next introduction is Carla Neal, the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. Sorry, you can just leave that.
No. Sorry. Sorry. I'm a bit technologically inept. But I have people for that. My name is Carla Neal, and I'm running for the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. This is the first time that I've run as a candidate in any election, although I've been a political junkie my whole life. Part of the reason why I haven't run as a candidate is because I know too much. And I can't not know it. There's too much wrong with each of the cartel parties that exchange power without really helping the people. It doesn't much matter whether we have a liberal or a conservative government, even if it's a minority, because they're not going to listen to us anyway. We get to vote once every 4 years and that's it. The Marxist-Leninist Party, on the other hand, has encouraged me, and particularly in this election, to speak in my own voice. So here's what I want to say. I've been a member of the Comox Valley Peace Group since shortly after 9/11. I have been a member of the Council of Canadians for over a decade. I was involved in Citizens for Quality Health Care in their successful fight to maintain 2 hospitals on the North Island. I'm also worried about what they're doing in the Campbell River labs up there. There's more information available about that. When it comes to health care, I rely primarily on a friend of mine who's worked in health care all her life. For food security, I rely on another friend of mine who was one of the women who started Lush Valley. And for those who don't know what it is, it's a food security organization. I've been involved in women's groups for my whole life, basically. I've always been a woman. I've always known what it is to be a woman. And it's one of the major driving forces in my life. I've been on picket lines for healthcare workers, teachers, forestry workers, and others. I have worked as a lawyer for 15 years, about 10 of those here in the Valley. I represented parents who had their children taken away by the state. These children were overwhelmingly Indigenous, particularly when I worked in Prince Rupert. I've been a first-hand witness to the intergenerational problems caused by residential schools. I want to address all these issues.
Next is Brian Rundle of the People's Party of Canada.
Hi. Is this working? Is that working?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's good. It's working.
Is it working? It's working now? Okay, there we go. There we go. Brian Rundle from the People's Party of Canada. I'm new. This is my first election, actually, and I don't normally do this sort of thing, and I wanted to get involved because I felt that things were changing in this country for the worst, actually. The last 4 years have been fairly tough, I think, on a lot of our institutions and our freedoms. We have a prime minister that doesn't answer questions, and we also are being censored as to talk about certain things. The media is basically also censored. The police are doing things that they shouldn't be normally doing. The military is being disrespected and underfunded and undersupplied. It just goes on and on. On the world stage, our country is not as respected as it once was. So the People's Party actually has a lot of policies that I think are probably the best way to get back to where we were, back to being respected, to being an economic powerhouse in the world. I mean, this country has incredible resources and opportunities for people, but we seem to be losing our opportunities. So to go on to a positive note, I met Max Bernier, and I think he's a great statesman. He's a kind person. He's well educated. He would make a great leader for our country. And I'll just tell you a bit about myself. I'm an accountant by profession. I've been in business for the last third of my life, and I've given up a bit of time and so on to do this, and I'm really prepared to represent this riding. There are some huge economic hardships and issues in this riding, especially with the fisheries, the forestry. These industries are our lifeblood, and there's forces at work to basically have them diminished. And then we come to climate change. Our party is I think the only party that really says there is no climate emergency. There is climate change, and yes, there are issues, but there's no emergency. We shouldn't be scaring the children. We shouldn't be having people live in fear to give up their freedoms and so on moving forward. It's a radical difference between our party and the other parties represented here. And so we're science-based. If you do the research, you'll find the truth. And this isn't a debate on climate change, but it is a huge issue for this election. Now, some of our policies are that we would actually have a smaller, more efficient government. We would also adjust, one of the main things is equalization. This equalization policy that gives Quebec a huge amount of money that's basically earned in Western Canada, that would be returned to BC. So under our government, if we formed a government, BC would get a lot more money, billions of dollars more, and life would improve drastically for people here. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to more discussion on all this. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Peter Schwartzoff, Liberal Party of Canada.
Good evening, folks. I am indeed Peter Schwartzoff, and proud to be your Liberal candidate. So I grew up in Campbell River. I'm one of 3 generations that worked in the mill there. And that's how I earned enough money to go to school and become an atmospheric scientist for Environment Canada. I'm also a veteran, having done 1 tour of duty in Baden, Solingen, Germany. Upon retirement, returned home to Campbell River, and there I've been active volunteering, doing all kinds of things, work with Greenways Land Trust. I've been on the board of directors for community living for 8 years. And I'm proud to say I'm a part of the Colour Party for the Legion. And I was your candidate for the Liberals in 2015. In that election, Canadians chose something different. They chose something very different. This election is about building on that change, about moving forward, or about going back to those very policies that you rejected in 2015. We promised then that we would strengthen the economy. Well, there's been over 1 million new jobs created. Unemployment's at a record low, and job wages are finally starting to rise. We said we would focus on the middle class. Well, we lowered taxes. We introduced the tax-free Canada Child Benefit. That single policy has lifted 300,000 kids out of poverty. 17,000 children are enjoying that benefit right here, and it's essential to many. We lifted thousands of seniors out of poverty when we improved the guaranteed income supplement, and we're proposing to lift many thousands more when we improve the CPP and the OAS. We also promised at the very same time we could protect our environment. Well, we put a price on pollution, and you've seen the challenges we've faced with conservative governments across the country for doing that. And we've invested $1.5 billion in the Ocean Protection Plan, which includes marine safety, but also just general improvements to some of the damages that have been done to the oceans. So you get the idea. We promised then that we could focus on the middle class, grow the economy, and still protect the environment. And we delivered. But we don't pretend it's all done. There's much more to do. So I mentioned I was a scientist for Environment Canada. I was one of those gagged by Stephen Harper. Back then, I was not allowed to talk about climate change, and I was very angry that we had removed so many of the environmental protections. But being retired, that all changed in 2015, and it hasn't really changed in 2019. That's still a primary goal for me. You know that you can count on me to protect the environment, but you can also count on me to still work on the economy and to try to make things more affordable for the average Canadian. So there you have it. We can go back to the days of the Conservative government, or you can choose forward with the Liberal government. Thank you so much.
Finally, our last candidate for introduction is Glenn Staple, Independent.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank the other candidates here. There will be some disagreements tonight, but I want to remind everybody that all the people up here are really great people. I've been in most of these parties myself, and I found that most of the people in the parties are really good people. Sometimes they have some goofy ideas, but the people are good, and that's true of all these people. It's also true of the leaders of the parties. The problem is not the people, the problem is the system. What we have is a system where, you see, I'm running as an independent. It's not just my personality, it's my association here. The original parliament back in England was all independents. The party structure grew up later. The independents represented their ridings, and they went to parliament. They selected the prime minister. Nobody wanted the job because they had to be responsible to the MPs. It wasn't the MPs that had to be obedient to the prime minister. The prime minister had to be obedient to them. When the parties formed, Canada inherited those parties, Whigs and Tories, Liberals and Conservatives, whatever you call them. But even at that time, the party leaders were selected by the MPs in Parliament. It was not top down. In 1960s, they started putting the names of the parties on the ballot. Before that, you had to know the candidate. You voted for the candidate. Then they started putting the names of the parties on, and then in 1970, they made it so that the party leader had to sign the nomination papers, and that was a really big mistake, because now the party leaders nix candidates they don't like. Which candidates don't they like? Well, in some parties, they wouldn't like anybody that believed in climate change, maybe, or, worked against the oil industry. In all of the parties, they will not allow a candidate that criticizes the state of Israel. The pro-Israel lobby is so strong in Canada that no candidate can get approved. Well, why is that? The party leaders are so powerful that if you are a lobby group, you need only to control the party leaders. They will control everything else. If I were to get elected as one of these parties, I would have very little choice of how to vote. I would have to do exactly as I'm told. So it's much easier for the big lobbyists to control the party leaders. They just need the leader in each party, and then they dictate down. So that's why I'm running as an independent. I will represent you. I will vote according to my conscience and according to my constituents. Thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming.
I want to thank all the candidates for their introductions and also for recognizing and respecting the good wishes of our great timers tonight. We're going to move on to the next section here, which is all the questions that have been forwarded from you. And I know many of you have many questions that you wanted to be answered tonight, and they may not be answered. Hopefully they will through their comments and through their rebuttals. But for the very first question, I'm going to be able to put it up on the display as well. And we're going to start, again, in alphabetical order, and then we're going to skip down. So the next round, Mark will lead off the round, and we'll go that way throughout the question period. So, Rachel, the question for you this evening to start will be, what is your position and that of your party on the issue of the global climate crisis? And what do you see being done about it here on the West Coast and nationally?
Thank you so much for that question. Well, the NDP believes that there is a climate emergency and that if we don't act quickly, and in fact, we haven't acted quickly enough, that we're already captured in this process that's unfolding. For our party, we have a pretty comprehensive plan on moving forward. One of them is a climate accountability officer. We want to make sure that this is measurable. A lot of constituents have said to me, we don't understand, is it happening, is it not happening? This is an office that would be independent and report back to us, what are our targets, how are we doing, and sort of create that sense of accountability that I think the government needs so much. We need higher targets, so we will be pushing for that. It's time to take the next step. I was really disappointed when I was elected to see the Liberals continue with the previous Harper Conservative targets. That doesn't really get us anywhere where we need to go. We want to stop money going to fossil fuel industries. The subsidies need to stop immediately. We want to see that money invested in a Canadian climate bank that will invest in local projects. I was just doing a tour of a housing project called Driftwood Design. They're making almost net zero emissions housing. It's really inexpensive, it's beautifully built, and it also is so affordable that people who are struggling with housing would be able to get into a house and not have the high costs that they are incurring right now as they see housing that have big emissions and they can't afford to do that. There's a whole bunch more, but my time is up, so thank you for the question.
The same question to Mark de Bruin. Do you need it? I don't think we need to read it. You have it there, and we have it on the board, so Go ahead. Thank you.
Well, the Green Party has this in its very DNA, and we know that there is a climate emergency sweeping this planet, and we have a very thorough climate action plan that we call Mission Possible. It is by far the most thorough. It is budgeted. The budget has been approved by the parliamentary budget officers, so it is not a pie-in-the-sky fantasy budget. It is real. It is doable. We stand for things like reducing carbon emissions by 60% by 2030. The Paris Accord called for 45. The other parties are well below that. The 45% gives us a 50% chance of keeping our global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So we're shooting for 60. And 100% off of fossil fuel by 2050. We want to ban fracking. We want to end all imports of foreign oil. We do oppose all fossil fuel projects, all infrastructure, because no matter what it is, pipelines, refineries, LNG plants, they all cost many billions of dollars, have to operate for decades in order to pay them off, which commits us to more decades of burning carbon fuels and exacerbating the climate crisis. We want to build a national energy grid, fully electric. We want to retrofit all buildings in the country, which will create 4 million jobs, according to the labor unions. We want to all new buildings to be net zero by 2030. We want a just transition to green jobs.
Thank you.
And much more. Thank you.
Shelley Downey.
Conservatives acknowledge that climate change and they agree that climate is changing. The question is, how do we tackle that? Tax is not a plan. A tax is a tax is a tax. So what we put forward is a document, and it's titled A Real Plan to Protect Our Environment, and in that we're focusing on technology as opposed to taxes. We're looking for a cleaner and greener natural environment, and also taking climate change fight global. We know where the greatest amount of the emissions are occurring, and that isn't here within Canada. That is outside our borders, and there is a great need to see that addressed in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So closer to home, under a conservative plan, it won't be free to pollute. Unlike the Liberal scheme, there will be no sweetheart deals for anybody. Rather than paying a tax to government, emitters who exceed limits will be required to invest in technology that will lower emissions to fight climate change. More personally, we are offering to Canadians a 20% refundable tax credit for renovations to their homes from anywhere from $1,000 to $20,000, just to offset and help reduce emissions within our own personal homes. Those are a few things that we're focused on over this next term.
Next question to be answered by Carla Neal.
First of all, let me say that I was on the climate march 2 Fridays ago, and the previous week as well. And I was thrilled. I was as happy as I have been in decades. Of course, climate change is real. It's not really a discussion, is it? Of course, we have to do our part. You may say, well, our part isn't enough. Tough. That's not a good reason to not do stuff. The science now exists to create a sustainable world. We have a lot of options. We need to have collective action, because most of the damage done to the climate has been done in the name of greed supported by governments in the service of the rich. Don't let them divide us into jobs versus economy, or environment, or East versus West, or Quebec versus Canada, or BC versus Alberta. Those are false dichotomies, and they should not be something we're buying into. The solution to this problem, as others, is fairly simple to say. It's not simple to do. We can empower ourselves by organizing our peers to provide solutions. Thank you.
Next to answer the question is Brian Rundle, People's Party of Canada.
Okay, here we go. Climate change. Yes, climate change exists and has always existed long before man walked on this earth, and climate will continue to change. The question is there an emergency? Is there enough of a problem that we need to give up our economy, that we need to radically destroy our main source of energy for our civilization? And our position is no. There is not a climate emergency. The oil and gas, there is no alternative to oil and gas right now. We have an oil and gas economy, and yes, renewable energy is there. It someday will be viable, but it's not now. Wind and solar are not viable alternatives. What's being proposed here is basically anarchy by people that want to basically just give up our oil and gas economies. This is an election about, there's a lot of misinformation. The science is out there. People say, oh, it's science-based. Well, the science, if you do the research, will tell you that there isn't an emergency. They talk about carbon. Well, it's carbon dioxide that's really the issue here. And carbon dioxide is the gas of life. Carbon dioxide is what greens the earth. And yes, there are changes. We're coming out of an ice age. I wish I could go on and on. I'm surprised my time is almost up. But no, we would withdraw from the Paris Accord, and we would cancel the carbon tax. That is our position. And thank you very much.
Next to answer the question is Peter Schwartzoff, Liberal Party.
So I mentioned to you that I was an atmospheric scientist for Environment Canada, so you know how I stand on climate change. It's why I got into the game. Now, this party that we've in already has set up a framework that will take us initially we're already three quarters of the way to making our 2030 targets. we now have put out an additional package that will help us exceed our targets by 2030, and we have joined the EU and 45 other countries in declaring that we will achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we have a plan. It started already. It's going to be expanded, and we will achieve those. But I wanted to talk briefly about India and China. How on earth can we solve the problem ourselves? Well, I just have been talking to a company that is going to be building a wood pellet. They're going to be making a wood pellet either in Port Ellis or in Campbell River for export to India to replace coal. It's an example of the new economy that you've been hearing about. What are these new green jobs? There are many, but there's a good example that's going to happen right in our own communities. Folks, there is so much opportunity coming. When we were talking to the kids in the schools, I was just grinning a bit because they have so much opportunity. The world is transforming and we're going to be ahead of the curve.
And finally, to answer the first question, Glenn Staples, Independent.
Thank you. Yeah, I ran for Parliament once before, 1984. The Green Party just started. I had on my campaign literature, my personal one, not from the Green Party, it was about carbon dioxide rise. This is part of the problem, that this problem was known about, 35, 40 years ago. But very little has happened. And again, I want to emphasize that it's because of the system, the way the system works. Yes, there is, I don't even call it a climate change problem because that really is under-defining it. I call it carbon dioxide and fossil fuel problem. We don't even know all of the effects. We do know that carbon dioxide is our primary waste product as humans. Every time you're breathing out your main waste product, carbon dioxide. It's up, does anybody know how much has it risen since like 1800? Is it 40% or 45? I can't remember. Does anybody know? How much has carbon dioxide in the atmosphere risen?
Was it around 350 to start the revolution?
Well, I think it was actually lower than that. Yeah. Okay, so it is definitely a problem. Carbon tax, nobody wants to mention taxes. Carbon tax is the best way to deal with it. The carbon tax as it sits now is not high enough to deal with it. This is the biggest global problem that we have ever faced.
Thank you.
So no wonder it's difficult.
We move on to the second question, and Mark De Bruin from the Green Party will answer it first. The question goes, the cost of housing continues to increase, and the supply and cost of rental housing, particularly for the marginalized, is a problem in many communities across Canada. What will you and your party do about this?
Well, before the 1970s, the federal government had lots of incentives to build purpose rental buildings. And since then, we've gotten onto a very long pattern of thinking that everyone should ultimately own a home. And so the CMHC's policies, government policies, have been largely driven to that end. And so it has left a lot of people behind who either don't want or aren't in a position to actually buy a home. Rentals are really in short supply. So the Green Party believes it's long past time that we deal with this issue. And we want to start off by passing a law which declares that the access to affordable housing is a fundamental human right in Canada. In order to back that up, we want to build 25,000 new affordable units and renovate another 15,000 every year for the next 10 years. We want to restore tax incentives to encourage purpose-built rental housing. We have $750 million for new builds and another $750 million for renovating older homes in our budget, all costed out. We want to allow the Canada Infrastructure Bank to put money into new and existing housing as well as all the usual infrastructure. We want to provide financing for nonprofit housing organizations focusing on things like cooperative home projects to build energy resilient and efficient homes, work with people with special needs and low-income families. there's a whole host of other policies and plans that we have underneath making it a right.
Thank you. The next person is Shelley Downey of the Conservative Party. Same question.
The Conservatives have committed to reviewing the mortgage stress test for a couple of reasons. One, it would allow others to get access into the market, and also there have been cases where people trying to renew their mortgages have been unable to because of that mortgage stress test that's in place currently. In addition, we're also looking at extending out the amortization term again and offering up to 30 years. The rationale here is that often a mortgage payment is less than a rent payment, and that is becoming, rents are getting quite high here in the valley and the whole island. Around housing, I would say that housing is an issue across the whole province. I'm a counselor for Town of Port McNeill, and at UBCM last year and this year, housing affordability and housing availability, two different things, but both are affecting the market right now. So one thing that we're looking at is reviewing federal surplus lands and making those available for housing. In Campbell River, they have a Habitat for Humanity project, and they're right now just finishing up a triplex, which now has brought on 11 units to the market. The land was provided free. The build is done by donations from within the community, and the prices and the mortgages are set at 30% of the income, and there's no interest on it. Freeing up available federal lands allows projects like that to go ahead for the betterment of everybody, and it frees up other rental stock. Thank you.
Carla Neal.
One of the biggest problems that I see with respect to housing costs is the misperception that renting is somehow lesser than owning. I've lived in the valley for 25 years. I've never owned a house here. I don't want to own a house here. That doesn't make me less committed to the valley or to the island. Secondly, social assistance rates have to go up at the very least. I realize that's not a federal issue. What can be a federal issue is a guaranteed living income, which would make it possible for people to pay the kinds of rents that the profiteers want. We need to stop speculators as well as profiteers from trying to make money off poor people. There's a particular slum landlord in this valley. He was forced by neighbors out of one neighborhood, but let's face it, he's got more. The other thing is the stigma attached to poverty, because landlords don't like to rent to people who are living in poverty. They don't like to rent to people with mental health issues, which is me, by the way. And they don't like to rent to addicts. Well, what then?
Thank you. The next speaker is Brian Rundle.
Right, thank you. Well, we face a very specific problem in this riding, in that Vancouver and Toronto are the two places that draw most of the people that move to Canada, that are new to Canada. And what's happened is prices have just gone skyrocket. They're just so high that a person even that has a really good paying job can't actually afford to live there. So what's happened is the population is spilling out onto the island and up the island, and prices are going up here, even in spite of our economies not being that strong. And there's a strike in the logging industry and so on, and there's shutdowns in fisheries. And at the same time, prices of houses have gone up. So what's driving it is a lot of foreign investment. I mean, probably many of you are aware of what's going on, but what can you do about it? And there is this one side of that. There's a lot of foreign money chasing property in BC, even on the island here, and it's people that don't necessarily live here. And so there's money laundering going on, all these things like this. So these are areas that the government needs to look at and try to curtail the washing of money that's obtained in Europe or Asia, and comes here invested in real estate, making the market go beyond what people can afford. The other side of this is looking at CMHC and so on. They have great programs, but again, they're just Band-Aid solutions. Like, you really need a good job. So just to I guess my time's almost up, but we want to build an economy based on the resources we have here, so people can have the kinds of jobs that can afford to have a mortgage. Okay, thank you.
Next is Peter Schwartzoff.
So Canada's first national housing strategy provides $40 billion over 10 years to reduce chronic homelessness and to remove more than 500,000 people out of housing need. It will do it through the creation of 100,000 new affordable units and the repairing of 300,000 existing units. In Campbell River, I can point to a contribution to Linda's Place, which is a 27-unit affordable housing, already being built with some of that money. Now, the Canada Housing Benefit, sorry for all these acronyms, will assist at least 300,000 people with the greatest need pay their rent. These would be people, welfare, people with disabilities, that level of things. And they're going to receive an average of $2,500 a year to help them, keep a roof over their head. As a longtime member of the Community Living, Board of Directors on Community Living, I'm pleased to say too that the Canada Child Disability Credit is going to be doubled. Twice as much money for families with a child that's disabled. We've increased the guaranteed income supplement that lifted thousands of seniors from poverty, and that's also helped them secure homes. And we're going to improve that benefit on the OAS when they reach 75, and the survivor benefit to the CPP also. So you can see we've offered a number of poverty reduction strategies in addition to actually creating new homes.
Next, Glenn Staples, Independent.
I kind of liked what Mark and Carla were saying about renting as opposed to owning. I know in Germany they have a very, very high rate of rentals. Very few people own their place. And that's one of the reasons their economy has been so strong, because people are very mobile. They go to where the jobs are. So renting is actually a benefit to the economy in that way. Some of the other ideas, I'm not so sure. Nobody talked about the capital cost allowance here today. It came up in Campbell River. I think that's a good idea to adjust that. I'm not so sure about the mortgage stress test, because one of the problems with, I grew up very poor. I grew up really poor in a house. You wouldn't want to see it. But I saved my money. I learned how to save very young, and I saved my money. And I owned a house, a little old house, but it had running water. I loved it. And but that was by the time I was 26, because I collected interest on the money I was saving. You put somebody into debt, and they're going to be in debt a long time if they pay for a house. So the mortgage stress test adjustment, not so sure that's a good idea. I built housing. I'm a carpenter, so I built housing. I know quite a bit about it. Best to let the free market deal with it. Creates tremendous efficiencies. Thank you.
And finally, to ask the same question, Rachel Blaney.
Well, housing is a huge issue in our riding. I was proud that I put forward a private member's bill that spoke to the right to housing. And one of the things I learned as I was doing that is that for the past 30 years, two things have been happening at the same time. One is less funding into affordable housing, all the different kind of streams that there are. And at the same time, the private sector was purchasing less and less housing to rent out to people. So when you have those two things happening simultaneously and nobody's watching it, guess what? We hit a big crisis, and that's what we're facing right now. In our office, we're talking to people who are housing advocates all the way to professionals, sometimes couples that both have a decent paying job and they still cannot find anywhere to live. Part of it is supply, and the other part of it is cost. So it's a huge emergency. We're dealing with people from all over the riding, even some of our smallest communities really struggling to find housing that's affordable. Our party has said we're not going to wait the 5 to 10 years that the Liberals are proposing through their housing strategy, but we're going to get houses on the ground because we know it's good for our economy, it's good for people, and it's good for our communities. So we are committed to 500,000 units in the next 10 years, and we're also offering a housing subsidy as we go through that transition to help people be able to afford their rent, because people are outbidding each other because there's nowhere to live, and that means that they're paying too much. And when they get evicted, it's because they can't afford the cost, and that's terrible.
I want to thank the candidates. At this point, I'd like to remind you that you do have a flag for up to 2 rebuttals. Please raise those flags immediately after this person has spoken. Starting off, the third question will be Shelley Downey. Shelley Downey, the Conservative Party. The question is, Canada continues to have an epidemic of overdose deaths. Where does your party stand on providing a safe supply of prescription-grade substance in order to stop the preventable overdose deaths from tainted illicit drugs?
So one of the goals that the Conservatives have is making recovery from addiction the goal of substance abuse policy. So to help Canadians recover from addiction, we'll revise the federal government's substance abuse policy framework to make recovery its overarching goal. The other thing we'll be doing is investing in treatment and recovery centers. To realize our vision to have recovery be the goal of substance abuse policy, we will invest in recovery centers, recovery high schools and treatment centers. And this will give those who suffer from addiction and their families and those who have recovered spaces where they can get the help they need and support each other. We had sat in a presentation in Vancouver, and I listened to Vancouver Health talk about all the lives they were saving with naloxone. And finally, a bold person said, okay, how many times can you revive somebody before brain damage sets in? And I think the number was 9 times. And then by then, the brain was so severely damaged. And the other question I had when I listened to statistics, and I thought, you know what, they've reduced it down. Every person became a statistic. Because the question I had was, what are you saving them to? We're busy, we're spending our dollars, we're reviving drug overdose people, but what are we saving them to? And that's why I'm so pleased with the approach that we have in terms of providing treatment and recovery so that people don't have to just wait to get another shot of naloxone. Thank you.
Next up for the same question, Carla Neal.
Okay. This is very personal to me. I know a number of people who have died from overdoses. I know even more people who have died because of the lifestyle that's forced on them by the stigma of drug abuse. People who abuse drugs don't do it out of the blue. There is almost always an underlying mental health issue that has been untreated. The stigma against people who have mental illness has got to go. It is absurd. It is an illness. It may not take just a pill to solve it, but it's an illness and it should be treated as such. Addiction is an illness and it should be treated as a medical issue, not as a criminal issue. When I was practicing criminal law, a lot of the people that came through court had both mental health and addiction issues. It was a big problem. It called it dual diagnosis. There still aren't enough places for those people to get help. I also think that all drugs should be legalized and they should be regulated. Did you know that fentanyl was a legal drug? Do you know that if you've been under anesthetic in the hospital, most likely you've been given fentanyl?
Thank you. Same question, Brian Rundle.
Well, I'd like to just point out that one of our platform basic things is that we want to honor the jurisdictions that the province has and what the federal government has. Now, over time, it's been kind of blurred about many of the parties that have been in power get into all kinds of issues that are actually really the provincial jurisdiction. Now, health is a provincial jurisdiction. It's funded by the federal government. There's a major transfer. Like the federal government pays for it, but the province delivers it. The province makes those kinds of decisions. So we're going to respect that. we defer to the province to actually deal with these kind of issues. I mean, this is a horrendous problem. I don't pretend to fully understand about addictions and what should be supplied and so on. Well, I defer to the medical profession, and that would be actually governed by the provincial government. And so what we propose to do is to empower the provincial government, especially British Columbia, by giving them the resources to deal with these things. So under our government, they would have a lot more money to deal with these kinds of issues. And that's pretty much all we'll say about this, about the drug problem. Okay, so thanks.
Next up is Peter Schwartzoff.
So first of all, we Liberals accept that this is a health issue, it's not a criminal issue. Working from that standpoint, we are the ones that made it possible for safe injection sites. It started small, it proved itself, it's starting to expand. We're comfortable with expanding much further. Safe injection sites give you the opportunity to protect yourself, to stay alive until you can make the decision to actually do something and take advantage of the services that are offered through that facility. Its purpose is to keep people alive until they can make the right choice. Otherwise, they probably won't. Very interesting to listen to you, Carla. You obviously know much more about this than we do, but we agree right up to the point where you said that all drugs, all illicit drugs should be made legal. We don't feel that way. We're not ready for that. We did marijuana, though, so that's done, but we're not ready for the rest of the drugs.
Next up, Glenn Staples.
Okay, so this is where it's going to be. I got an idea. Oh, gee, this sign is terrible. Okay. Listen, this harm reduction thing, I don't think it's working. The, 4,600 overdose deaths in Canada last year? It's a really serious problem. I just checked, now this is going to be a bit of a stretch for most of you, okay? Singapore has the death penalty for drug dealers. Now, 4,600 opiate deaths. Where are the dealers? Shouldn't they be charged with murder? I just checked and I looked at the statistics. I taught mathematics. My calculations show they executed 11 drug dealers in Singapore in 2018 or 2017. They have hardly any overdose deaths. I figure proportionally, Canada would have to execute 72 drug dealers, but we would save 4,000 addicts' lives. My experience is the addicts that I've met are, you take away the addiction, they are good people, generally good people. The drug dealers, not so much. The drug dealers I've known have been very greedy people that just are doing it for the money. So I say save the addicts, get rid of the drug dealers.
Thank you. Next candidate for the same question, Rachel Blaney.
So thank you for this question. It's really important. A little while ago, I did a tour of a safe injection site, and it was very compelling to listen to the people who work there and how they were there to observe, to make sure people were safe. And one of the biggest challenges we know in this riding with the overdoses that we've had is often people are taking their drugs alone in an isolated place, and that puts them at higher risk of dying because if something does go wrong, there's nobody there to respond to it. So I believe that what we've been facing is a public health emergency. We've asked the federal government several times to call it this so that we can get the resources on the ground that are so desperately needed. The issue of the tainted drugs and how to approach that is really complex and important, but again, we have to find ways to decrease that isolation. I was talking to some paramedics that were telling me that they're creating an app right now. So if you have a tainted drug, your response to that is usually very fast. So when you take the drug, you can push the app, and if you don't stop it, it will call the ambulance. for you. So there's a lot of things happening. It really concerns me. And we also have to look at the cycle of addiction. And right now, the cycle just continues because we don't have the appropriate supports for them and we don't have appropriate housing. We could do a lot if people had a safe place to live and they weren't always sent back to the communities where they already had the addiction by the end of their treatment and the end of their sobriety. Because if they go back there, it starts all over again.
Thank you. And finally, for the same question, Mark De Bruin.
Yes, it's very heartening. I think there's almost unanimity here about the situation we're facing, and that it really no longer is a criminal matter, but a public health matter. And the Green Party agrees that we need to declare this a national health emergency so that all kinds of supports and funding can be sprung free to start dealing with this. One of the countries we can look to as a real model for how to go about this in a very different way is Portugal. They have decriminalized all drugs there, and they have made great strides to make them legally available in a highly regulated way. And in that society, drug addiction has plummeted. They've also been able to deal, therefore, much more effectively with all the mental issues that many drug addicts have had. So the Green Party recognizes that the epidemic of overdoses is really more accurately called an epidemic of poisonings because it's due largely to contaminated fentanyl, and that is a poison. Drug possession should be decriminalized. People need to have access to a screened supply and the medical support that they need to combat their addictions. And the Greens want to increase funding to community-based organizations to test drugs and make naloxone kits widely available to treat overdoses much more than they are currently, recognizing that there's a limit to what can be done. And treatment is a key piece to dealing with it as a national health emergency.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've had a report in the other room. They've lost audio. Is that still the case? It's back on. Okay, thank you. It's just temporary. We move now to the fourth question, and Carla Neal will start off the question to respond. Minute and a half. The question is, how will you and your party ensure the National Poverty Reduction Strategy and its legislation reflect Canada's commitment to reduce poverty by 20% in 2020? Carla Neal.
Poverty reduction can be easily done, but there are barriers. Those barriers are not monetary. Those barriers are stigma and blame. It is not a moral failing to be poor. It is not a moral failing to be mentally ill. It is a moral failing to be greedy and selfish and opportunistic and to take advantage of other people. Stop blaming poor people for being poor. Get together, find out what poor people want from you. Ask them what they want. Ask them what they need. What poor people want most is the ability to choose. And without being asked, how do they get to choose? These solutions are easy. They can be done. All we have to do is listen to the people who already know what it's like to live in poverty.
Next to the same response, Brian Rundle.
Yes, poverty is a big issue. What I like to say about that is that our party, again, wants to defer to the provincial, the province for dealing on health and social issues to address poverty. So again, what we really like to do is put the policies in place to have a good economy, and once the economy improves, that would allow a lot more resources and so on. A lot more people would be taken out of poverty when there's an abundance of good paying jobs and opportunities for people. And so that's why we want to reduce taxes. We want to keep our resource jobs intact and encourage oil and gas to actually still be the basis of our economy. And so through a vibrant economy, once expanding and growing, the resources will be there for people to not be in poverty. And that's our policy on that. Thanks.
Next speaker is Peter Shornoff.
Thanks. I already actually outlined a number of things we're already doing. I talked first about the Canada Child Benefit that lifted so many kids out of poverty just there. The numbers are over 300,000 children just lifted from that one thing. And I talked about seniors. So many seniors are poor. And the guaranteed income supplement lifted thousands of people that way. So easy to make small adjustments and help so many that we've already done those things. Not to say that the job is done, but I mean, just to point out, we've already started to do a few things. There was another thing there that's actually a positive poverty reduction measure when we rolled back the age for pension from 67 to 65. There's a lot of seniors waiting to collect that OAS. So that was a poverty reduction measure. As far as taxes go, most poor people don't pay taxes, but now there will be even fewer because we're going to increase the point where you start to pay taxes. We're going to increase that. That's part of our plan. I talked about all the housing things that we're doing, including doubling the the Child Disability Benefit, the support for people the poorest of the poor that are having problems supporting their rent. We've got quite a package, and although we tend to be focused on the middle class, we're also focused on jobs, and the best anti-poverty measure we can think of is to give a person a job, so those that are able to work. Thank you.
Next up is Glenn Staples.
Yeah, the poverty thing, I know to me the big problem is disparity. When you look at happiness in various countries, well, if you look inside a country, you'll find the rich people are happier than the poor people. That shouldn't be a surprise. But the surprise is when you compare rich countries to poor countries, richer countries are not happier than poor countries. What makes the poor unhappy is when they see a rich person that has something they don't have. I grew up very poor, and I hated it because I watched the other kids doing things I couldn't. But when I grew up, I felt looking back that that was the best advantage I had, because I felt a level of success from simple things that wouldn't have satisfied somebody that grew up rich. Poverty is relative. We're in a church here. I've never been up in front of a church, but think of Jesus, what he said. I hope this is not too far here. He said it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than to pull a camel through the eye of a needle. Think about it. I think he was right. But the other one was the Buddha. Buddha says, he figures out, where does suffering come from? It comes from desire. What's the best way to beat it? Is to overcome the desire. So when you see somebody has something you don't have, forget it. Overcome the desire.
Next up, Rachel Blaney, New Democratic.
Thank you so much. Well, this is a really important question because poverty is increasing in our communities. The NDP actually put forward a motion or a piece of legislation around having a national poverty reduction strategy. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals voted against it. And I think it's important to look at these strategies because what it really does is say, how is the federal government going to work with their provincial and territorial counterparts to address poverty? Because how poverty is expressed is different across the country. So we need to address it in that way. So the NDP have put forward some things that I think are really hopeful. Things around housing, I talked about that already, but also having a national senior strategy. We have a lot of seniors falling through the crack. I understand that the Liberals think by increasing the GIS that seniors are escaping poverty. I would not argue that that is the case based on the information that I've heard from seniors across the country. They are still really struggling. We also want to look at childcare. We have in our country childcare costs that are more than people's rent or mortgages. So how do you get ahead if you keep having to pay and pay and pay? While at the same time, we want to make things fairer. We know that right now the most wealthy of us are hiding money overseas. They're using tax loopholes to hide their money. We want to see a wealth tax. We want people who are not paying their fair share when all the rest of us are to start paying their share. And that's how we're going to find a way to pay for these projects that are going to help lift everyone up.
Next up for the same question, Mark De Bruin.
Well, in 1989, the old line parties that were in government at the time all unanimously agreed that they were going to eliminate poverty by the year 2000. And this is child poverty particularly. And we see how successful that turned out to be. Child poverty is the thing that is most concerning to me. It's probably the most shameful thing going on in Canada. Of the 38 countries in the OECD, Canada rates 25. So we have a tremendous problem with child poverty in this country. The Green Party's platform is based partly on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals put forward by the United Nations for lifting humanity by the year 2030 into a sustainable, green, livable society worldwide. Canada has signed on to those. One of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals is the elimination of child poverty by 2030. So we are very much dedicated to doing that. Probably the main thing in the Green Party's vision and platform is what we call a guaranteed livable income. That would do more than anything to lift everybody out of poverty. This is not a new idea. Martin Luther King said it in 1967 that he was convinced that was the only way to rapidly and permanently remove poverty from the nation or from the world. So there's a great deal more in our platform on that. Look forward to discussing it. Thank you.
Shelley Downey, of the Conservative Party.
Thank you. The Conservatives believe that those experiencing chronic homelessness need stable support and assistance in times of great need. And that's why the previous Conservative government focused on helping Canadians through proven, evidence-based homelessness reduction program. By removing the 65% Housing First investment target, the government is opening up the door for funds to be diverted away from proven methods of ending homelessness. Our goal is to continue to fight for proven, evidence-based efforts to end homelessness. You need a home. Everybody, you need a home, whatever it looks like. And that's often a first start, and we've heard it with our harm reduction program for mental health. People need shelter. In my area, the Mount Waddington Regional District has a health network, and in there we talk and we have a strategy going on, and we've had regular meetings to address housing in the area. And I know that we met across the island with other health networks, and health networks are connected, they're on the ground, they pull together people from multi-facets who can address mental health, just everything about health and wellness gets pulled together. We sit at the table and we discuss how we're going to move forward and address the benefits of our communities in order to promote better health. And that's one area that I can see that has had fruit. It's bearing fruit, and we're seeing changes in our local area.
Thank you. We're moving on to question 5, and Brian Rundle will lead it off. The question is, the call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women provide a framework for how we can move forward as a nation in reconciling and being in good relations with each other. How do you see your party working with the United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples to bring about true reconciliation? Brian Rundle.
Okay, the first thing I'd like to say about this is the United Nations doesn't always have the best interests of Canada at heart. Our party does not really want to do what the United Nations says. We want to work it out with First Nations directly. We want to get rid of the Indian Act, and we want to replace it with something that's more of a nation-to-nation relationship. And I'll just say a little bit more with the United Nation. We believe there's, have you heard of Agenda 21, Agenda for the 21st Century? We believe this is not in the best interests of Canada or our citizens. And that if you just, I'll just say, if you just go on the internet and type that in and see what's involved with the sustainable development, and just take a look around, there's all kinds of negative things that are going to come from the UN agendas for Canada. Now, as far as the inquiry and so on, these are things we like to work out directly with First Nations and not have to go through the United Nations. So that's our policy, and it's going to take a long time and work it out. But I personally had some work with the Indian Act, and it was good and bad, but I think we could do a lot better. Thank you.
Next to respond is Peter Schwartzoff, Liberal Party.
So since 2015, the Liberal government's been committed to a renewed relationship with First Nations based on recognition of rights, respect, and cooperation and partnership. And we've started to walk the path of reconciliation that was using the map that was given to us by then Justice, now Senator Murray Sinclair. We've also accepted and tried to enact the declaration, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Regrettably, it was killed when the Senate hung it up, and then it was lost when Parliament was dissolved. But we will reintroduce it at the first opportunity. I'd like to say too that, you know, sometimes you hear a few things that aren't quite accurate. So for instance, about water. So we've already fixed the water supply to 85 communities, and we'll do the last 57 by 2021, and this does include Grassy Narrows. We also have provided new resources for keeping children safe and to ensure that families can stay together. Now, you may have heard on the news that we've reneged on a judgment that we owe restitution to children that were removed from their families. We, in fact, acknowledge the harm that was done and that compensation is due. We would just can't deal with it right now during the election. We just need a judicial review to give us a bit of a delay. Thank you.
We have a rebuttal to Peter Schwartz's comments by NDP leader Rachel Blaney. She has 1 minute.
I'm not the leader yet, but I just want to say this, that I have to rebut that. So Cindy Blackstock's organization, who has been fighting the Human Rights Tribunal, who got this moved forward. So I hope you know 7 non-compliance orders by the Liberal government. Not only it's totally misrepresentation to say that they're not supporting, they just want to wait. They want to wait till after the election. The reality is the government of Canada has told Cindy Blackstock, who sells teddy bears to fundraise to pay for these court cases, has asked her to pay the government's fees as well. So they are fighting it, and they are asking them to pay for it. So that isn't asking for a little bit of time after the election. That is an attack against the Indigenous children of this country who have put up with enough, and we have to stop it.
Next to answer the question, Glenn Staple, Independent.
Yeah, this issue is a really deep one. I lived and learned on 3 different Aboriginal communities in Canada, and this history that Canada has on this is really deeply shameful. And it's one of the things my daughter reminds me of is that, and I was the same when I was in school, you barely learn about it. You learn the history, Champlain, all the explorers, all the white history, but they really don't dig into the apartheid system that we created in 1876, when we classified people by race and we treated them different by race. And incidentally, South Africa and Israel both came to Canada to study that system and implemented them there. South Africa has gone through Truth and Reconciliation. Israel hasn't even started on it yet. the thing is, the reconciliation is a really hard thing to get through. These problems are really deep. I could tell you so many stories living on reservations, the type of things that happen. It is so deeply troubling. And it takes, I don't know how many generations to clear it out of our system, but it has to be done. We need to get to a point where there's only one kind of citizen. Only one kind of citizen. It doesn't matter which way you tip the table. It's not good.
Thank you. Next to respond is the NDP candidate, Rachel Blaney. Same question.
Thank you so much. Well, this is something I'm personally very passionate about. My granny went to residential school from the time that she was 4 until she was 16, and I've lived through the impacts of what residential school does in a family. So the path to reconciliation is about acknowledging the history, being honest about the history, and all of us carrying the history and not putting that on Indigenous people to carry in our country anymore. Our member, Romeo Saganesh, actually is the one who brought forward the private member's bill on implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It was Bill C-262. I was devastated to see it lost to the Senate. I thought that was completely wrong, and something that we all need to reflect on is the role of our Senate. So when we look at reconciliation, it's about going through that lens of the rights of Indigenous people. It's about Indigenous people having a voice and a seat at the table. And I think we saw last summer when the Trans Mountain Pipeline was going through, how the court said, again, you're doing the same thing. You're taking notes, you're not consulting appropriately. So how long is the question? As Canadians, are we going to continue to go to court to fight and to lose again and again? And the Human Rights Tribunal and the decision that was made, Indigenous children in this country are being marginalized. Indigenous communities are being economically marginalized. Until we take that next step forward, none of us are going to be free of this history that is so systemic in our system.
Next to respond is Mark De Bruin of the Green Party.
Yes, indeed, it is very deeply systemic. The Greens believe that Canada cannot reach its full potential until full reconciliation takes place and all outstanding treaties and land claims are settled. We are the only party that has repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which probably is where the roots of this systemic difficulty began. That happened in the 14th century when the Roman Catholic Church and some of the colonial governments of Europe deemed that if their explorers landed on a land that did not have Christians living on it, it was essentially unoccupied and could be claimed. And that mindset set the stage for what we're dealing with now. So that doctrine still exists. No one actually talks about it. I don't think it's used in courts, but we have repudiated it. So we also want to do the following kinds of things. We want to implement all the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We embrace all 46 principles of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and want to enshrine them in Canadian law. Canada has agreed to them, but they're not legal. They are grounded in the doctrine of free and prior and informed consent. We want to reject the Indian Act and enter into a process led by First Nations people to replace it with self-governance, which they will design.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next to respond is Shelley Downey of the Conservative Party.
So to ensure that Indigenous people share fully in the prosperity of our country, a new Conservative government will work collaboratively with Indigenous communities and leaders to review the Indian Act and other government policies and procedures to remove barriers to prosperity. Many Indigenous people face a significant socioeconomic gap compared with other Canadians, and will work with Indigenous communities and leaders to identify these barriers and provide solutions. To make sure that decision makers, and not just note takers, are listening to Indigenous voices, we will continue to have dedicated ministerial portfolio for consulting with Indigenous rights holders on major projects. The courts have been clear that the Crown's duty to consult must be genuine, two-way communication. And above all else, reconciliation can't happen without relationship and without respect between parties. And that will be something we'll be striving for and putting forward always.
Finally, for the same question, Carla Neal, the Marxist-Leninist.
First of all, truth is not absolute. The indigenous people's truth is different from the settlers' truth. I was raised with only the settlers' truth. And when I first was introduced, sort of almost accidentally, to sort of the white man's version of Native culture, it piqued my interest. And in my teenage years, I saw the trial of Louis Riel put on in Saskatchewan, and that piqued my interest even more about what had happened in the area. Never heard the word Métis when I was a child, and I've been interested in ever since. There are all kinds of campaigns led by Indigenous people, the Red Dress campaign, the Indigenous women's marches that took place recently. Can't remember the exact date. Of course, the Indian Act has to go, but it can't go and leave a vacuum. That there has to be something there. And that can only be written by natives. We need respectful nation-to-nation talks. We need the Indigenous people to be able to exercise their rights without having to go to court to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. We move on to the sixth question, and Peter Schwartzoff of the Liberal Party will start this response. The question is, number 6. Surprisingly, in this federal election, we are hearing little about Canada's role in the world. At this time of extreme global inequities caused by global trade and the climate crisis, what is your party's position on foreign aid and our involvement in the United Nations and its peacekeeping forces?
It's a very interesting question, and I don't understand really why we haven't been talking about it. I guess there's so many other things that we've been talking about, but I'm very proud of the way Canada is viewed in the world. We're often seen as a beacon of hope for the poor and I've been on the Syrian Refugee Committee, and I speak to the Syrians that come here, and they have this awe of Canada before they arrive. It gets a little tarnished once they've been here. Peacekeeping was something that was disappearing. Did you notice before 2015 we committed we would go back, and we have in a small way. We went into Mali where we provided medical support, and that small contribution, which was easily within our means, it turned out to be, Canada's back. Have you heard the expression? It was actually said within the United Nations peacekeeping force, thank goodness you're back. It's a step, and I think we're going to expand that. Our First Nations, our foreign aid support has been less than UN had hoped for, less than we committed to. But we continue to improve it in very specific ways. It's not to countries, it's to specific things. It's like children so they can have an education. It's people living in refugee camps so they can have a normal life and we don't lose a generation of them there. It's for women's health. We've got very specific things that we give the money to, and I think we could be more generous than we are. Thank you.
Next response from Glenn Staples, Independent.
I think this is one question where Brian and I will differ on this one, because I think international affairs are really important. Let's say in the old days, you had these civilizations arise in different parts of the world, completely independent. Like it or not, we live in a one civilization world now. We are in a global culture. What is done in China affects us here. Goods flow around the world. We need more global governance. I'm sorry, but we do. And the United Nations as it's set up is not really adequate to the job, especially the Security Council with the 5 permanent members with veto. That is not a way to have a fair and just world. We need more global governance, not less.
Next to respond, Rachel Blaney.
Sorry about that, waiting for a microphone. You know, this is a really important question. I believe we need to continue our foreign aid. There's a lot of good programs that it goes into that really help stabilize communities. It's so important to invest in women and children across the board. This is something that I fundamentally believe in and the NDP believe in. When it comes to peacekeeping, it's something that Canada has had a great reputation. We're still not sure. The Liberals haven't been clear in their last government about what the commitment to expand is going to be. You know, people from our area were in Mali doing the incredible work that was happening there. They were really creating a significant change. And the NDP was asking, why aren't we staying until the new folks are coming in? Because there was a gap. And that's not good. If we're really trying to help with action, even when we send people into these dangerous areas, when they're providing that stability, we need to be there. So I'm looking forward to seeing more commitment from Canada around peacekeeping. We have a unique role. I know one of the commitments that I made because I was representing the 19 wing was I joined on the executive the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I met with parliamentarians from the other NATO countries, and they always talk with such respect about our men and women in uniform and the work that they do. So we need to make sure that that Canadian voice is heard out there because we provide stabilization. We need to see those temperatures go down. And when we look at the reality of our neighbors next door, it becomes even more important that Canada take a leadership role.
Next to respond is Mark De Bruin.
The Greens will work to restore Canada's long-standing approach to multilateralism and build upon the legacy of Lester Pearson, who you may remember, some of us anyway, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in that area. One of the expressions of that is Canada's overseas development assistance budget, which Lester Pearson committed to being 0.7% of our gross national income. We've never reached it as a nation, but most of our fellow nations that committed to this have reached it or even exceeded it. We want to strengthen Canada's role in promoting peace and global cooperation. We want to reestablish the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, which was dismantled by Stephen Harper. We want to mandate it to provide overseas development assistance where it is needed most. We want to eliminate the requirement that that aid be tied to Canadian business interests overseas. We want to ramp up our contribution to the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility to $4 billion per year by 2030 to combat and mitigate climate change. And we want to review the federal government policy to align with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN and use them as a mechanism to track progress in meeting these targets globally.
Next to respond, Shelley Downey.
So we've committed to cutting 25% of our foreign spending. And the rationale there is that we're sending money to countries that don't need it. And what we will be doing is sending money instead. $700 million will be going to countries who are in desperate need of funds. Along with that, we're looking at strengthening our commitment with our allies. Part of that will involve our procurement policy for equipping our military. Right now, we are ill-equipped. We have drug on acquiring a fighter jet and instead opted to purchase used ones from Australia. That isn't acceptable. If ever there was a joint initiative, we would not be able to partake with our allies. And so that is a priority for us to get our procurement policy in place that is a little longer than an election cycle.
Next to respond, Carla Neal.
Right now, the way that foreign aid is used, it's spent only on those countries whose political politics that we agree with. We use it to punish those whose politics we don't like. That's wrong. We need to have an anti-war government and make Canada a zone for peace, not send our troops overseas on the false belief that they're keeping the peace. That hasn't been the case since I've been, since I've known about foreign policy of any kind. We need to get everybody together. We need to have talks with other nations, regardless of whether we agree with them or not. We shouldn't be imposing our solutions on other cultures that simply don't, can't use them the way that we intend for them to be used. We have to ask people what they want, not tell them what they need.
Next to respond is Brian Rundle.
Well, our policy is to basically not do foreign aid except in cases where humanitarian or crises are there. So this whole idea of there's a $6 billion budget right now, and I think $2.3 billion was spent in Africa studying climate change and providing reproductive services or abortions, I call it what it is, for Africa. And we believe that if it's not in Canada's interest, that we won't do it. We want to be generous, but we're trying to balance the budget, and this is one area that we would really only restrict paying funds for, as I said, a crisis. Other people have talked about the military interventions. I'd like to also add, we would stay out of any interventions around the world where we do not have an interest, a direct interest, and that's another policy we have. So thank you.
And the next question, we've all covered this question, right? Correct.
Yep.
So the next question will be responded by Glenn Staples. Most of Canada's resource-based economy, such as fishing, logging, and mining, are in a state of transition. What will you and your party do to ensure opportunities for good, well-paying jobs across the country? Glenn Staples.
I think logging and mining, I think, are more provincial jurisdiction. Generally, I think one of the areas where I differ with most of the panelists here is on the importance of free enterprise and business. I find that the business that is operating in a competitive environment is really much more efficient than one that's highly controlled and receiving government stimulation and all that. But on these issues of the resource sector, generally, I think we're better to try to get more manufacturing in. Resource nations tend to be dominated by manufacturing nations. They just become suppliers for manufacturing nations. So we should be trying to shift more to manufacturing and the tech sector. There's a local business success right here, My Tech Guys. That's a fantastic little business, an example of what you can do with that entrepreneurial spirit. And that's what I like to see when it comes to creating jobs. Thank you.
Next to respond, Rachel Blaney.
And then you become mayor. So I think this is a really important question. And I think when Canada looks at itself and the changing economy that we're facing, knowing how we're going to transition is becoming more and more part of the conversation. I know for myself, what I've been doing is working with local municipalities, regional districts, and Indigenous communities to find ways to make sure we have enough infrastructure, working really hard around cell towers and high-speed internet, looking at those key things that make the area more attractive for more diversification. So that's part of what I've done. But I think we also have to look at local solutions. So the other thing I've been doing is meeting with local businesses that are looking at innovative solutions for some of the problems that we have and some of the employment needs that we have in this area, and seeing where we can help them out. What is it that's going to help get them over the tipping point? You know, when we're sending huge amount of subsidies to the oil and gas industry and we're not investing in our local communities as we face this transition, it makes no sense to me. So around fishing, I've been fighting really hard for a comprehensive strategy. We know our wild salmon are in serious trouble. So we need to get in there. We need to be part of the solution. Working with organizations like Iron and Earth, which is a group of oil and gas workers that know that they need to transition, and they've actually done the work themselves at looking at the skill sets they have and what that can be translated into the new green economy. There's expertise on the ground. It's our job as federal representatives to meet with it and encourage it and see what solutions we can look at locally as well as nationally.
Next to respond, Mark De Bruin.
Well, the Green Party likes to think that it watches where the puck is going, not where it's been. That's a metaphor I'm borrowing from Peter. We are not only talking about transitioning on a small scale, it is going to be on a very, very massive scale. So there are three priorities the Green Party has in this process of large and possibly quite disruptive transition at times. One is protecting workers whose incomes and work lives are being and will be disrupted by dying industries, by artificial intelligence and robotics as they transition away. The second one is to enable the creation of new jobs in a green economy, and this is often talked about as though it's kind of theoretical and oil and gas is so important we can't do this. Well, Canada's clean energy sector has produced 300,000 new jobs by 2017, and the jobs are growing at the rate of 4 times the rate of the average job increase in average industries. It could reach 560,000 jobs by 2030. That's 160,000 new jobs in the next decade, and that's more than enough to make up for the 50,000 oil and gas jobs that will be transitioned out of. So it's very doable and it's very exciting because the potential is enormous. We have all kinds of policy around how to do this and programs to fund it, including training programs that are very specific to individual communities.
Thank you. Next to respond, Shelley Downey.
I think we need to look at who the influencers are right now over these industries. Right now, there are a lot of people who either are out of work, will be out of work, or are scared for their jobs completely. The Liberals brought down on October 1st a declaration to go to closed containment by 2025. The industry has said, we are not there yet. We're working on it, we're spending the money, and we've been investing. We're not there. 5 years is too quick. That's 7,000 jobs, $1.5 billion out of the BC economy. We have people who work in oil and gas sector. They live across this whole riding and are out of work or fearful they will be losing their job. So I guess the question is in the last 4 years here, we talk about transitioning people away from jobs, and we're going to do this really nicely and kindly. Well, let me tell you, in the last 4 years, it sucks. You have done a really crappy job. They have not been looked after. So now you're also asking us to believe you that you're going to shut down oil and gas, aquaculture, our fisheries, our wild stock, and our commercial, our recreational took a hit this summer, and we're just supposed to roll over and say, yeah, we believe you, you're going to look after us. I don't think so. No one's believing you guys. Liberals, you have not done the job.
Next to respond, Carla Neal.
Again, this implies that we're supposed to pick one or the other, jobs or climate. Do we want good jobs or do we want to protect the climate? It's a false dichotomy. Don't get caught up in it. It is not one against the other. These good jobs are being provided not because of somebody's generosity, but because the American oligarchs, in conjunction with the cartel parties in Canada, have decided that that's the way things are going to be, and that's the way that they can keep control. Good jobs are those that are safe and that pay well, and those are available in green industries, and they are also important to keep for ourselves. We have to support unions and their fight for justice and for the retention of good jobs. We need to keep value-added jobs here on the North Island, and one way to do that is to ban raw log exports. All value in society is produced by workers.
Thank you. Next to respond is Brian Rundle.
Well, I think if you take a common sense look at this, you have to admit we have a resource-based economy, not just here in this riding or on the island, but pretty much in the whole country. And what's been proposed here is to shut down big areas of our economy and then all move transition into these jobs, these renewable energy jobs. Well, and then a lot of numbers thrown out there are, this is a battle of misinformation. A lot of people in Alberta and in BC have already lost their jobs in oil and gas just from the fact of these pipelines not going ahead. And these are good paying jobs. This is the $100,000 a year kind of job that you can have to actually afford to buy a house. I mean, that in the renewable energy, we talk about these jobs, like what jobs? Renewable energy is actually a false narrative in many ways in that it's not here yet. The technology is not developed enough for us to actually move to that kind of an economy. So what's going to happen if you shut down a resource-based economy? Then we're going to all move to these jobs in this renewable energy economy or the green economy that isn't really here yet. The science is not here. One of the problems with renewable energy, there's no way to store energy for very long periods of time. So it's just not common sense. We need to keep the resource industry going for another period of time until we can move to something else, but it's not here now. We have to keep our resource-based economy. And I guess my time's up. There we go.
And final response, we've got a rebuttal from our independent Peter Staples for 1 minute.
Yeah.
Sorry, Glenn Staples.
Yeah, I'd have to disagree with you, Brian, about that. It's kind of like horseshoes and harness in 1900. You know, it was on its way out. Well, all of that, if you're talking about the oil industry, electric cars, you know, there are ways of storing energy. There's a lot of alternative energy. There's a lot of stuff happening. Those are new jobs. They're good jobs. And it's not all doom and gloom, you know. It's possible to change.
And the final response for this question is Peter Schwartzoff.
So our crappy job of trying to manage the economy has produced 1 million new jobs. Unemployment is at the lowest it's ever been since we started measuring it, and wage growth is rising. So there are jobs. In fact, if you would like a job with Coast Guard, DFO, Environment Canada, I know they're all hiring. Community Living is hiring. They can't find workers. So the world is going through an economic transformation. This isn't a Canada thing. It's not a Liberal Party thing. It's happening. Our choices are either be dragged into it or get ahead of the curve and take advantage. To get ahead of the game, to be like Gretzky, we are proposing that we invest heavily in entrepreneurship because we know that's where jobs are created. And specifically, if you're the entrepreneur and the type of thing that's going to help us reach our net zero emissions, you will go to the front of the line with us. There will be new jobs in an entirely new economy. Around fisheries, yes, we did say we will take ocean pen farming into closed containment. does not necessarily mean out of the water. And I've been recently talking to a few dissenting voices within the fish farming industry that says, yes, it's hard, it could be done. Our job is to make sure it's a responsible transition and that we keep those well-paid jobs right here.
We have a rebuttal from Shelley Downey. 1 minute.
Sorry. A couple comments regarding, yes, you've created lots of jobs, but guess what? Some people are working 5 jobs. I talked to a couple, between them, they're working 5 jobs to earn the wages they need to run their home. Yes, you got lots of jobs, but they're not great jobs. Further to that, your comment about fish farms and such, the product that's being produced in the ocean is superior to what can be produced on land, and there's acknowledgement of that. And so the question becomes, do you produce a product to produce a product, or do you produce a product that people will buy? Because if it's not marketable, there's no market, there's no retail, it has no value.
Another rebuttal from Mark DeBrun.
I'd like to point out that the transition that we have entered and that we're going to enter as a roller coaster is not primarily economically driven or human driven. It is driven by physics. Physics is changing the world, and we have to move along with it. And there are many smart people and nations who recognize this. Saudi Arabia is building one of the largest solar farms on the planet. They also have the largest petroleum reserves. They see what's happening. Morocco is building an enormous, they already have, building an enormous electrical plant based on solar energy. They want to become Europe's primary electrical supplier. Foreign investment money all over the world is pouring into green energy and out of fossil fuels, except here in Canada, where we are laggards and we're not recognizing where the puck is going. So I want to make clear that whether we cooperatively and willingly make this transition or not, it will be forced upon us one way or another. And if we don't participate willingly, it's going to be quite difficult.
Thank you. We have another rebuttal from Brian Rundle, the People's Party of Canada.
Oh, this is an interesting topic. Yes, it is about physics. It's about science. Right now, the science is not here for renewable energy. Germany has invested $1 trillion into renewable energy, and they have not even reached 20% of their energy needs. Australia has gone into solar and wind. I actually pay a power bill in Australia, and it's 4 times what we pay here. And it's just not here. There is science behind this. There's 500 scientists just wrote a letter last month to the United Nations saying that there is no climate emergency, that we shouldn't do anything radical like give up our oil and gas, give up our economies. It is a fact that we cannot store electrical energy in industrial quantities for very long periods of time. And that will change in the future, but right now the batteries are not there. In fact, all these batteries that we do exist are made of lithium, which is a very corrosive substance. But please find the truth. It's on the internet. You can find it.
We have, thank you. We have 3 minutes to 9 o'clock. We have to stop it at 9, but if we start the next row of questions, we will be going right through to the end of this question. Is anyone okay with that? Continue on. One more question? Okay, moving on to question number 8. Starting off will be Rachel Blaney. Half of the world's mining and exploration companies are based in Canada and work in 100 countries. The rural communities in these countries, often indigenous communities, live with the negative social and environmental effect of mining. What will your party do to ensure that human rights are protected when Canadian companies operating at home and abroad? Will your party make it easier for those who are harmed to get access through justice through the Canadian courts? Rachel Blaney.
Well, thank you for that question, and the answer for the NDP is yes. we actually brought forward a private member's bill in the House of Commons to address this very issue. We know that Canadian mining companies are out in other countries doing things that in Canada we would not allow. And it's really embarrassing to suddenly become Canada the friendly to Canada the person that's doing human rights violations in other countries. So our private member's bill actually said that any Canadian company that was outside of Canada and operating in that kind of manner would be held to account by Canadian standards. I think when we look at our international reputation, we have to stand up for workers, we have to stand up against this kind of behavior, and it's about time that we did it. So yes, we would support that. We would definitely defend human rights, and we would make those businesses accountable in our country and face the penalties as appropriate. Thank you.
Next to respond, Mark De Bruin.
Yes, the Green Party also gives a very strong yes to that question. We want to lead a global effort to reform the World Trade Organization so that agreements there include environmental standards and respect for human rights, which currently are very, very much second class. But there's a really big problem with Canadian mining companies, particularly internationally, and that is that many of the agreements we have with other nations contain this Investor Settlement Dispute Clause, ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement Clause. We had one in NAFTA, and the US wanted out of it in the new NAFTA, and so thankfully it's gone. And that is the clause that allows foreign corporations to sue governments of nations where they have investments if those nations pass laws that threaten the future profits of those corporations. Now, Canada has suffered under that because the US has done this a number of times to us, and we've paid a lot of money out over a few years on that. We got rid of it, but we still have them in our other agreements with other nations. So when Ecuador, for instance, wants to pass laws to protect its indigenous people or its environment, they are under the threat from Canadian mining corporations to take them to court, to a tribunal. Those are not government tribunals. They are appointed by the trade organization itself. They are outside of international law. We need to change that. We need to rip up those agreements and have those companies accountable and prosecuted in our own country, not by a 3-person unaccountable tribunal.
Thank you. Next to respond, Shelley Downey.
So we've targeted mining companies in this question here, but I want to remind you of an engineering company located here in Canada called SNC Lavalin. They were brought before the courts for their handling of their funds that went into another country. Those funds were used for the government and for a certain family, and they left their citizens beggared, and they did not look after them. So why are we going to target a mining company? We had a Liberal government that then went further to defend this Canadian company by interfering and preventing their Attorney General from, they were intimidating the Attorney General to interfere and to allow this remediation process to go ahead. I find that abhorrent.
Next to respond, Carla Neal.
Yeah, Canadian mining companies are bad. And they are supported by all the other big businesses and the cartel parties in charge of this government and the American government. They all work together as one. It's all part of the same problem. Going to court and suing people is not the solution. I've been to court lots. Let me tell you. You know, suing someone is not easy. It takes forever, and the companies have all the money in the world. And the money they pay out to defend their court cases is deductible. This should also have been encompassed in the good jobs part, because they are jobs that destroy the environment with impunity, not just in Canada, but elsewhere. But But it's not a question of environment versus jobs. It's not a question of money versus the environment. Why are we forced into making these artificial choices? We know what the solutions are. We don't have to support these mining companies. We don't have to support the governments that may pick this oligarch over that oligarch.
Thank you. Next to respond, Brian Rundle.
Well, our party believes in the rule of law, and believe me, I think that the rule of law has been eroded over the past 4 years. The things like these mining companies have done things like, well, let's talk about SNC-Lavalin. There's some sort of connection between North Africa and them and all the corruption that's gone on. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's all kinds of other things going on. We believe in the rule of law, and it should be the same for everyone. If there's all kinds of things done with corruption or international laws are broken and so on, that yes, those people should come to Canada and be able to be treated fairly in the courts. And we would not interfere with those things. That we respect the courts and the rule of law and our other institutions. Thank you.
And next to respond is Peter Schwartzoff.
Canadian companies are not shielded from their bad actions elsewhere. An example that was already raised is SNC-Lavalin. They got caught using bribery to win contracts in Libya, and they are charged before our Canadian court system. Yes, there was a lot of controversy about doing an alternative way of charging them, a deferred prosecution agreement that definitely our Prime Minister's office wanted the then Attorney General to consider, and was found to be breaking ethics guidelines around pushing so hard. But he has said, and I believe, that he was deliberately primarily motivated by 4,000 jobs that he believed to be at risk. That's what happened. But nevertheless, the bottom line is SNC-Lavalin is going to court. They're not being shielded. They're not getting a deferred prosecution agreement. They will face justice here in Canada for actions that they took in Libya.
Thank you. We have a rebuttal, 1 minute rebuttal by Shelley Downey.
Just want to cycle this back to the jobs. When is it all right for a federal government to set one province's jobs, place a higher value on those than another? And we heard all through that whole process about the lack of care and the lack of compassion for what was happening in Alberta. And we're seeing that same thing play over here now in BC when it comes to our fisheries, because they have now been so mishandled. We can't show favoritism amongst the provinces.
A rebuttal by Peter Schwartzoff, 1 minute.
So actually, this rebuttal is an agreement. We can't. And SNC-Lavalin is an international corporation with offices across the country and people that work across the country. They do big jobs right here. They've been doing many millions of dollars worth of work recently in Campbell River. They have well-paid jobs right across the country. We would never do it because it was a Quebec thing, but the Minister of Papineau might, the Member of Parliament might, and I would for our own region. I would stand up for jobs right here in North Island, Powell River. So it's not a one province versus another province thing. It's all the jobs across Canada. Thank you.
The final person to answer the question at hand is Glenn Staples, Independent.
Yeah, it's amazing we got this far without SNC-Lavalin coming up. Normally I tend to agree with the Liberals more than the Conservatives, but on this one I have to say I agree with Shelley. SNC Justin screwed up. That's as simple as that. They should never have passed that SNC-Lavalin law, which they passed just for SNC-Lavalin. They shouldn't have pressured the Justice Minister, who, by the way, is an independent candidate. Why is she independent? because the Prime Minister was trying to force her to do something she shouldn't do, which is what cannot happen to an independent. Think about it. Elect an independent here. Jody Wilson-Raybould came from this community, you know? Yeah. So, yeah, I'm sorry, but Justin screwed up on that one.
We have a rebuttal by Brian Rundle, People's Party of Canada. 1 minute.
Well, I'd like to add, Glenn, that if she was elected as an independent, she would have never been the Attorney General in the first place. So she never would have had that opportunity. I just wanted to tit for tat.
These people are using their flags. Okay, 1 minute for Peter.
Now,
For Mr. Staples.
if they were all independents, like the original Parliament, I think I might have supported her for Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a remarkable evening of questions and answers. We've actually rolled right through to the end of the question and answer period. We do the final closing remarks now, only 2 minutes per candidate. And as it turns out, it rolls right back to our very first introduction. Rachel Blaney of the New Democratic Party, 2 minutes, please.
Well, thank you all so much. First of all, I just want to say thank you for participating in democracy. This really matters, and you being here is really important. And I want to thank Dale for doing a great job. I think it's a lot of work to manage all of us, and so I appreciate that. And thank you for the food. First all candidates meeting where they gave us a snack, but we're so busy talking we don't want to eat. So I just, again, thank you so much. You know, I'm so inspired by doing this job the last 4 years. I remember walking into the House of Commons for the first time and seeing my name on one of those desks and understanding that only 338 people in this country get that opportunity. I really want to thank everybody for allowing me to do it. I'm proud of the work that I've done with my team. I think collaboration is a good way to move forward. I've stepped up to a lot of hard conversation in our communities across the third largest riding in British Columbia. We have a lot of ferries, people, let me tell you. And, you know, sometimes it's really hard, and I've had to sit through things that were really uncomfortable. But I think that when you ask to lead, you have to understand when you don't agree with people what you need to learn more about, and I think I've done that well. And I also just want to say that child poverty in the North Island is actually second only to East Vancouver. And so in British Columbia, we have a long way to go. Those kids are struggling every day, and those families are with them struggling every day. So, you know, I could tell you so many stories about the people in our riding and the ways that they're particularly struggling. But at the end of the day, we are all in this together, and we have to find pathways that will lead us to success together. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do that for you. So thank you so much.
Closing comments by Mark de Bruin.
Well, we are in a time of tremendous change, and I don't think it's any longer adequate to do things in the old way, where MPs are mostly preoccupied with just local issues, just local constituents. There is a much bigger picture that we now have to really take seriously, and it requires a huge vision. So the old things that needed to be done still need to be done in spades, but all under this very large umbrella of how are we going to keep this planet inhabitable. We have a very brief time to do this. You've all heard the figures from the IPCC, I'm sure. We've got until 2030 to get it more or less done. So far, we're nowhere near the right track to be accomplishing this. This is what the Green Party brings to the picture, as well as very solid policy on such things as social justice, reconciliation, women's rights, fairness to workers, creating jobs, affordable housing, protecting our coast, but always, all while transitioning our communities to a clean, green economy and a livable world. So we know there's a climate change. We know that it's bad. We know that it's caused by us, and we know that it is dealable with as long as we all get on the same page together. One of the things that we want to do as Greens is create an inner cabinet, a climate cabinet, totally nonpartisan, to which all parties come, and we work together as a team, as Canadians, to deal with this challenge before us. It's nothing to do with politics. It's certainly not partisan. It's not NEP or Green or Liberal or anybody else. We have to work on this together. This is why I'm running. I think it takes integrity, and we've had a sore lacking of that, and the Greens bring that. Elizabeth May is a great example of that. If you want to see her in action, she'll be here on Thursday for a whistle stop for 45 minutes in Comox and 45 minutes in Campbell River. You're welcome to come and meet her, see her in action. And if you don't know how to vote, let me leave you with this thought.
Sorry, thank you.
Ask your kids and your grandkids.
Thank you. Next for closing comments, Shelley Downey, Conservative.
So our Liberal candidate will be asking you whether you want to go back to the Harper era or move forward. So I'm going to ask you, do you really want to go back to more of the following? A Prime Minister found guilty twice of ethics violations, deplorable treatment of our military personnel, such as we saw with Vice Admiral Mark Norman, a cabinet minister ousted from cabinet and caucus for doing her job, such as Jody Wilson-Raybould was, continued deficits in times of no wars or recession, adding to Canada's debt, lies about balancing the budget. Trudeau said, and I quote, "I'm looking straight at the Canadians and I'm being honest the way I always have. We said we're committed to balanced budgets, and we are. We will balance that budget in 2019. It's 2019 and it isn't." Our Liberal candidate also refers to himself as a muzzled scientist, yet he rolled over on his personal belief that aquaculture is important to our communities and it is being done safely when his party, and that it's being done safely. And that's a quote from the paper. So my question is he now muzzled? And also, is he going to actually stand up for North Island jobs that we just heard him say? So in January, when I started knocking on doors, everything I heard was about affordability. The last month or so, it's now, will I even have a job? That is the priority people have. So the question, who is going to support us? How do we support ourselves without work? We can continue to prosper. We can do it by harvesting our resources, at the same time reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Governance is a responsibility to allocate resources and provide services for the betterment of everyone within this country. And leadership requires honesty and integrity. You will get that from the Conservative government, and you will get that from me. Thank you very much for your time.
Next for closing comments, Carla Neal, Marxist-Leninist Party.
There was a couple questions that were sent to each of the candidates that we didn't quite get to. One of them had to do with seniors, and that to me includes things like health care and child care. These should not be considered costs. These are investments. For every dollar you invest in child care, you save $2 later in the justice system. We need to have a guaranteed livable income to reduce the stigma attached to poverty. We need respect for Indigenous rights, and we need to listen to Indigenous voices. We need to empower people so that they will have a say, that they feel they have something invested in our society. If you don't feel like you're empowered, then you don't feel like you have a say, you don't feel like any of it matters anyway. You don't feel like you have any input at all. I believe society needs a government that humanizes the political and social environment. We need a government that works for everybody, not just the 1% who are overwhelmingly white and male. I want to empower women and recognize the value of women's work, which is either not paid at all or underpaid.
Well, here we are, the big election. Your vote is very precious, and you have to make a decision who is going to best represent this riding. One of the things that I haven't heard anybody ever mention is ferries. The price of of ferries affects everybody so much here, yet no one's talking about it. Why not? I think that would be one of the major things that we need to take to Ottawa. Did you know that the East Coast gets incredible subsidies on all their ferry traffic? They get about $430 per person per capita. We get like $1.50. I mean, is that fair? Where's the lobby? Where's the voice for this riding saying we deserve to be treated the same as the East Coast? We need someone that's going to represent these issues to you. The economy is, when you talk to people here, the economy is the main issue. Like, people are worried about their jobs. There's agendas here to go into suppressing our resource development, which is the basis of our whole economy. So this whole idea of be scared of the future of the climate change so that you'll give up your freedom, give up your jobs, and you'll do with a lot less. These are huge issues facing this riding. You really have to ask yourself, are you well represented, and can we do better? Some of the policies that our party has is like, we have the lowest taxation of any party that's proposed here. I could go through details, but if you look at our website, you'll see that. And what that also will do is bring in foreign investment. Did you realize that investment in this country is fleeing under the last government? It's like, to come here and bring your money here, it's a bad deal. You have to go through all kinds of hoops and so on. And plus, the taxation rates are higher than other places and so on. Yeah, and we have all these restrictions. So the thing is, you really choose carefully who you want to represent you. And I propose that our party actually has the best policies for this riding. Thank you very much.
Final comments from the Liberal candidate, Peter Schwartzoff.
Thank you very much. My Conservative colleague here is consistent with the party leadership in that she has chosen to use her final remarks to make personal attacks rather than to lay out her plans. I won't respond in kind. Instead, I will say that we're very proud of our past 4 years. The economy is doing well. Jobs have been created. Jobs are going empty because they can't find the workers. The new economy that's coming, we're planned to be ahead of the curve to make sure that the young people have the jobs of the future. That's the economy. It's working quite well. The average family is concerned about affordability. We've got a wide range. You've heard some of those things now about how we're addressing affordability. And then there's climate change in the environment. The very reasons I ended up getting into this business, this crazy business. I was gagged by Stephen Harper. I wasn't allowed to talk to you about the work we were doing at Environment Canada. And I was really annoyed that all of those environmental protections were removed. Thank goodness they were returned under this government. So there you have it. Give us a chance. We will move forward, strengthening our economy, building the new economy, maintaining those environmental protections. On Friday evening before the long weekend, we learned what the Conservatives will do if elected. They will cut $53 billion of the investments that we've made in the middle class. They'll take us back to the Harper years. If you like those, vote Conservative. Infrastructure spending will be slashed. The Canada Child Benefit that we are so proud of will be at risk. And of course, they will do nothing on climate change. So your choice really is clear. Keep moving forward, build on the progress the Liberal government has made, or lose it all and go back to the politics of the Harper years. Choose forward, vote Liberal.
Final comments by Glenn Staples, the Independent.
Yeah, I spoke earlier about the problems of the top-down parties. One of the other problems with that is the polarization that you get into. Once the parties get their positions, they start hurling insults at each other, and that concentrates them into a smaller area. And I felt sorry for Peter here, because I got into it with the SNC Lavalin thing, and then we got everybody kind of picking on the. I just want to say that I've been in most of these parties, not the PPC, but you know what? Honestly, the Liberal Party was you're going to be surprised here. The Liberal Party was the most open-minded party, the least self-righteous. And So, I'm sorry, Peter, but SNC Lavalin was still a disaster. Just let me just say, in terms of the independents, see, I've got things in common with all of these people here. I agree with them all about some things. Some of the issues I agree with PPC about, we didn't get into tonight. But I can agree with a lot of them on like climate change and that. I'm with the lefties. And business, I'm with the righties. I'll vote for whatever is best for the riding, and I'll vote by my conscience. And a lot of these issues out there amongst you is more wisdom than we have up here, okay? There are ideas and things that you have that you've never spoken about. So send them to my, I got this website here, eh? My daughter, you can get in touch with me and send me all your ideas. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.
What an evening. I want to thank everyone tonight. Start off with our sponsors, Comox United Church, all of the volunteers that put this forward. It's a donation in the back. All the hours that you have no idea went through to prepare for this evening. Thank you very much for the Comox United Church. The RTech guys that have used their skills and technology to spread this word around so many of your friends and colleagues and maybe spouses at home can watch this and you can review it on another day. This is a thankless job, and it requires a lot of work behind the scenes. Bob missed supper tonight with his family, and he was out here many hours, and he's done this not just tonight, but every night around the valley, helping out, making sure that people have their voices heard. I want to thank you. I especially want to thank the candidates. As you've seen, their hearts are in it. They're not being very malicious. They're trying their best. They've got a huge track record of helping communities, helping people. They may disagree, but their hearts are in the right place, and it makes me very, very proud to be a Canadian. So a big round of applause to all these great candidates. And finally, I need to thank you, the citizens of the Valley and of the community and Vancouver Island, North Powell River. I thank you for your cooperation, your polite patience through this. My security people didn't have to bounce anybody out of here, and we thank you very much for that. I hope you've had a wonderful evening. Safe drive home. Good night.